parallel what you have in the I district, but I have a real concern, and I appreciate your zeal to want to find tax rateable, because we all like tax rateable. But retail really concerns me. Bringing retail in out there really concerns me.
Right, well, that's why I'm not saying the umbrella retail, but I'm sure there's certain retail uses that we can think of that are non-competitive with what we have downtown, because I think that's your concern, as is mine, about competing with what's downtown. But I'm sure there's certain uses that would not be competitive. Like, as I've said a multitude of times, supermarket. Putting that in that zoning as one retail use in addition to an I-2 zone would be perfectly legal.
Well, the supermarket is one thing, if that's what you mean by retail.
And there could be other things along the line similar to that. You know, like I said before, I don't know the exact verbiage, and I don't have that background in planning and zoning, but something like maybe electronic stores. I don't know details. I would need to hear from our professionals, but I can't think of, you know, anything that would be super competitive that we could have out there. You know, I think that there's room for growth.
Okay, I see that what you're saying is you want to talk to Stu again. And
on certain issues, but I'm one person, and if the rest of the board feels that there's nothing that's retail at all that's worth revisiting, then I don't want to spend our money on planning purposes when people already know. You know, so that's why I bring it up for discussion. But I think that there's definitely retail uses that could be brought in that wouldn't be in direct competition with what we have downtown.
Well, in the supermarket, is one thing. I think that the difficulty you run into, you have to define it so, because that's when you set yourself up for people being able to take you to court. If you are capricious in not being definitive about what it is you're allowing, and if you say, I want this kind of retail store, and I don't want that kind of retail store, that's where it gets dangerous.
I agree.
So
that's what we need Stu to find too.
Well, then what is it that you're really after? I think that you're saying that if we would like to be an opportunity for there to be a grocery store out there, well, I doubt if anyone's going to say no.
I mentioned that 6-7 months ago when I wasn't introduced to this.
I know, but that's because it's been focused on in all of the other areas, for example, where it kept it on this side of the highway.
Right.
So you didn't have people going in over there in order to. And that was, planning-wise, a comfortable niche, the way that it was designed. So it kept anything that was going to bring in a lot of people on this side of the highway, so it kept all the people serviced over here. And on the other side, it was the offices of the major things that are outlined in here. I think that, I appreciate what you're saying, and my major concern is that we have to determine, we have to come to a conclusion.
Yeah.
That's my primary concern.
We also need to do it the right way. We don't want to rush. And if it takes another few months, then it is what it is.
No, I'm certainly not rushing. I'm simply saying I think we need to come to a conclusion because there are time restraints that are put on us that we have to abide by, and I wouldn't want it to run into any difficulties. And I know that all of the agencies know that we're working in earnest on this, but I think we have to come to a conclusion. That being said, I think that we've worked long and hard on getting here. That doesn't mean that I'm inflexible at all. It just means we've worked long and hard on getting here. And I think that when we massaged it last time, and we're going through it, step by step, and maybe that's what we need to do again before we come to closure. Sit and go through it step by step, through each one. We embroider within the accessory uses by permit and conditional uses by planning board flexibility that took it beyond solely medically related. It expanded to professional offices with no association with warehouse facilities for a specific reason, because warehouse facilities are such an entirely, we're talking box stores out there.
We could regulate the size though, couldn't we?
Once you permit, and I can only say this from my experience sitting on the planning board, once you permit a concept, and you know full well that warehouses, in order to make money, have to be a certain minimum size, then you are creating a vulnerability in your law.
Well, I think, though, at the same time, if you said warehouses, you could also put in certain caveats that say no bigger than this, or this specific coverage ratio. and needs to be this offset, correct?
Look, I'll talk with
But is that
Stu
true?
about it. No, I don't think so, because the bottom line is, when you permit, if you say, I permit multiple dwellings that are 16-stories high, and the guy comes in and says, look, I can't make a profit unless I make it 24 stories high. And then you've opened the door for them to be able to go in and say, as we've had happen here in the village when times got tougher, I can't sell these units predicated on what they were approved for. Let me go back now to the village and say, I need this to be altered, because that's what the market can bear. So when you're creating a minimum that you know is far below what most warehouses are going to be demanding in order to be viable, I think that warehousing is something that I definitely would have great reservations about.
But on Greenwich Avenue, isn't there some kind of restriction that there can't be more than 2 stories?
Yeah, but
And that hasn't gotten us sued, or that hasn't gone for anything, right?
that's not the same thing. That's not the analogy I'm making. The analogy I'm making is if you allow 18 stories, I just made that up.
Or 2 stories down the road.
Okay, 2 stories, and then someone comes in and says, I cannot make money unless I make it 11 stories.
So are you uncomfortable with 2 stories on Greenwich Avenue?
I don't know how this is morphing into that. Maybe you're not.
Because the idea that you have a zoning where you put in certain standards, minimums, maximums,
Yeah,
that's your zoning. That's what it is.
I'm well aware, but I'm giving you an extension beyond that, Kyle. I'm saying if you put in something like a warehouse, let's stay with what I'm questioning, the warehouse. If you put in warehouses and you're going to permit them, but you only permit them if they are so many, 500 square feet, all right, whatever it is. And then they come in and say, great, we're making application. Only the minimum that we can survive at is 20,000 square feet. You've already opened the door to warehouses. It becomes far more difficult, because now you've opened the opportunity for them to come in and go in front of the ZBA, claim hardship, and if that's what you want to set it up for, I just want you to be aware that that's what will be the next step. When you come up with zoning, you're trying to give a frame to work from, for the village to work from. And if you create pockets in the zoning law that are unrealistic because you know that minimum cannot be maintained, then you're leaving yourself open.
But I think, though, that argument negates any idea of the zoning, because I know that you're saying they're not connected, but if a developer comes in on Greenwich Ave and says, I am having a hardship unless I can make my building 3 stories tall, it's the exact same.
No, then you say no. However,
so we can say no to a warehouse.
The difference here is, and then I'll stop. The difference here is warehouses, you know, if we went and measured, got the square footage on all the new warehouses around the county, none of them, in my opinion, none of them are going to be small enough not to have an exceedingly negative impact on that entire parcel out there.
What do you mean by negative impact? Just so it's clear to me.
Proportion, size,
Aesthetic,
size
you're talking about?
No, I haven't gotten to that yet. The proportion.
We can control that too.
Well, I think that you want to be able to control those things, Kyle, but as you just said, I think we need to get that from the professional, because I don't see that being something that you can control to the degree that you think you can.
By that argument, there's no sense in doing any zoning, if everything's challengeable.
I'm sorry that you feel that way. I'm not saying everything's challengeable, and I don't think it's become productive. I simply will say for the record that the bottom line for me is in creating zoning, I want it to be viable zoning, that I'm not creating a law that is looking for people to come and try to get around the law in order to make it viable. And for me, that's what I see warehousing included out there does.
We're not looking for, because I'm looking at this as a practical matter. I've gone through this list and actually spent quite a time with it this weekend. Some of them we know just aren't going to happen, and not that they shouldn't stay on the list, like hospitals, for example. That's beyond our control. That has to do with that deed restriction. But we have to look to the future, 20, 30, 40 years from now, and that deed restriction doesn't exist anymore. I think it was 10 years, whatever it was. But I just see things I just don't see any practical use. Indoor recreation center, for example. Great idea, but they finally got their act together.
They're over there on
Chester,
Well, I mean, that's why it was in there.
so, and they hadn't when we got it in here, but they now finally got their act together, so I don't see that ever happening anytime. And I'm just looking at it from a business perspective.